Hi, guys, and welcome back to the Female Fitness Podcast. I'm your host, Danny. This weekend, I am having a really nice sort of me weekend where I get on top of everything, all of my life admin, all of my behind the scenes work admin. I'm getting on top of podcast recordings and content, and it just feels so good. I feel like it's been so needed because I've not had a weekend like this in a while, and it just feels so good when you get on top of everything. But in today's episode of the podcast, I'm going to talk about the common misconception that when you transition from a rigid to a more flexible approach to nutrition and you start to focus on your relationship with food and your body image a little bit more, you're going to lose control and gain a ton of body fat because I know that it's a really common belief and it's also something that stops a lot of people from taking a more flexible, more holistic, health focused approach to all things health and fitness, training and nutrition. But that approach, moving towards a more flexible approach, moving towards a more holistic, health focused approach, could be the best thing that a lot of you ever do. So I want to make sure that that fear, that misconception does not stop you from moving towards a more flexible approach. Or even if you're starting your fitness journey, I want to make sure that that fear, that misconception doesn't stop you from taking that approach to begin with either. So I wanted to start by saying I understand where this worry comes from. It's valid, especially if a rigid approach to nutrition has facilitated progress you've wanted to make in the past, such as with fat loss. It can be really scary to let go of a tool that has once served you, even if it might not be serving you anymore, even if, you've been through a fat loss phase in the past, taking quite a rigid approach. And then over the long term, you've ended up back where you've started or in an even worse position. It can still be really tempting and appealing to go back to that really rigid approach because it did facilitate fat loss progress. It did facilitate helping you get where you wanted to be. And so I understand your pull to it completely. And your fear of letting go of a control is very valid. So I just wanted to point that out. And I also understand it because a rigid approach on paper, where you're meticulous with, say, tracking your calories or macros and calculating your cardio and your steps and all of these things, on paper, it makes sense. It makes complete sense because we know that if, for example, your goal is fat loss, we know that being in a deficit is going to help you achieve that goal. We know that if your goal is to build muscle tissue, being in a surplus is the best place for you to be to achieve maximal progress with that goal. And being meticulous with your intake and your activity levels is going to help you, of course, in some circumstances make sure that you are in that deficit or the surplus or at maintenance or wherever you may be to facilitate progress towards your goals. We would assume. However, yes, in theory, it helps and it facilitates that progress. But in practice, we see actually a lot of downfalls with this approach, and we're not robots. So it's not as simple as, giving ourselves X number of calories and expending X number of calories because it doesn't always work out like that. There's so many factors outside of our control. And if we impair things like our relationship with food, that will get in the way with our ability to achieve our goals, as well as impairing our overall health and quality of life as well. So it's really important to take a step back and look at the bigger picture and recognize that the way that things seem in theory, such as, working out your intake and your expenditure and tracking accurately and that kind of thing, it doesn't always work out like that in practice, even when we have the best intentions. So it's really, really important to consider the bigger picture when it comes to deciding what approach you're going to take. And another factor I think it's really important to address is that people usually feel quite a pull to taking a rigid approach, such as tracking really accurately or following a meal plan, because it gives them a sense of control, and control feels good for a lot of us, especially if we feel a little bit out of control of other aspects of life. However, just because seeking that extreme control feels good, it doesn't necessarily mean it's what we need, or that form of control is not what we need. So it's important to question that rather than just acting on impulse in these kinds of situations. So I want to talk about a few things which will help you get clear about why being a little bit more flexible and a little bit more holistic and health focused can be beneficial, and why sometimes a rigid approach might not be what you need. So the first thing is, and this point will really help you wrap your head around taking a more flexible approach if that's something that you're interested in, is that it's the actions behind the data that will determine whether you gain, maintain, or lose body fat, or whether you progress towards your health goals, your fitness goals, your strength goals. It's not the data itself that matters, it's the action behind the data. And if you recognize this, it can help you wrap your head around the fact that tracking is not magic. Like tracking your intake, tracking your expenditure, tracking your workouts, it's not magic. It's just a tool to facilitate behavior change. However, if you focus on behavior change without that data, you will still get the desired outcome. So if, for example, you say your goal was fat loss, right? And you needed to pursue fat loss for health reasons. If you focused on behavior change that facilitated an increase in your activity levels and a bit of a reduction in your intake, that would result in you being in a deficit and succeeding with that goal of fat loss if it's something that is beneficial for your health. And on top of that, it would likely, in most cases, set you up for much more long-term success because you have actually focused on changing your daily habits and your behaviors on a consistent basis rather than being ruled by these numbers. And that way you are no longer you're not relying upon the tools such as tracking. And so even when you haven't got access to that tool, the behaviors that you've put in place, you'll still recognize that they really matter. You're no longer reliant upon this tool, you're no longer ruled by it, and you're therefore much more likely to actually stay consistent and see long-term success if you focus on behavior change without that numerical data being needed to facilitate that behavior change. So that's something that is really, really powerful to recognize. It's the action behind the data that matters, not the data itself. And that applies for anything. And if you've ever been in a situation, this is an example of the kind of relationship with data a lot of people come to have at some point in their health and fitness journey, is that a lot of you will have been in this kind of situation where you've forgotten your fitness tracker, whatever it is, whether it be your Apple Watch, Garmin, Polar, heart rate monitor, whatever it is, and you've thought to yourself, what's the point? Doing this workout or doing this walk or whatever it may be, does it really matter? Because I haven't got the data to go with it. That's an example of the hold that data can have over you and the negative impact that it can have. Because if you actually had made sure you didn't become reliant upon that data and you recognize the benefits of the behavior behind the data, the action behind the data, you wouldn't have gotten into that mindset. You would have been like, okay, cool, I don't have the data to go with it, but I'm still going to go on that run. I'm still going to do this session. I'm still going to go for this walk because the data is just a very, it's a very small part of a very big picture. And it's just something that it's not something that determines whether my actions have been beneficial or not, whether they're worth doing. I don't have this massive attachment to it. I'm not reliant upon it. It's just, helpful from time to time. So we want to create that more positive relationship with data where, yes, it can be helpful at times, but we're not reliant upon it. And that will improve our ability to still take the necessary action to move forwards towards our goals when data is not accessible or when it's removed, and increase our probability of long-term success as a result of that. So that's point one that I really wanted to hammer home. Secondly, to that, data is the data that we have access to, meaning you, if you're listening to this podcast, most likely, and myself, is never 100% accurate anyway. So even when you are tracking this data to the very best of your ability and you have, great, quite expensive data trackers, it's still never going to be 100% accurate. Our bodies are very complex things. And even when it comes to like tracking your food, for example, food labels only have to be accurate within about 20% of the food's actual value. So even if you're tracking 100%, it's never actually 100% accurate. And that can be really empowering when it comes to moving away from tracking, because it can get you to realize that, like, was it really serving the purpose that you thought it was? If you're only tracking within that, rough accuracy anyway, maybe you can lean into the discomfort of moving away from that, knowing that it was never 100% accurate. It was never really what you thought it was. So that's something to take into account. A lot of people as well find that being really kind of hyper focused on data, whether it be tracking your calories or macros or login sessions and that kind of thing, it can increase their drive to engage in damaging behaviors. In the example of food, tracking calories and macros for some people actually results in more overeating because it increases their drive to eat, it increases their food focus. And if, for example, they're in a situation where they've gone slightly over the calories that they were aiming for, it's very easy to then feel like you failed and be more likely to fall into an effort approach where you then continue to overeat because you're like, screw it, I've already gone over my targets anyway, I may as well continue eating. Whereas if you're not so attached to that data, say you don't track your calories or macros and you're accepting of daily fluctuations, you're going to be less likely to overeat because there's no on plan or off plan. There's no, I'm within these limits or I've failed. You're actually just accepting of it's okay for my intake to fluctuate. My expenditure's fluctuating on a daily basis anyway. And so it doesn't really mean anything if I've eaten a little bit of extra food and it's not it, therefore there's no longer that emotional attachment to it, and you no longer then feel that likelihood of falling into that effort mindset because there is no on plan, off plan, there's no right or wrong, there's no I've failed or I haven't. You learn to actually, engage in behaviors that are really supportive of your goals consistently on a daily basis. But there's not that same rigidity around it. And so you allow yourself to be flexible and you don't fall into this negative mindset around food quite so easily. On top of that, if you're someone that tracks, say, performance-based data and is a bit obsessive about it, say you're paying attention to things like calories burned, that can also drive quite a negative association with training and with exercise because it then becomes very easy to fall into the trap of thinking that more calories burned is better. And we all know that when people get carried away with that, which, a lot of you listening to this, you've probably been in that boat, and that's okay. But we know that when you've been in that situation, you can create quite a negative relationship with exercise, with training, because one, you lose the important purpose of it in terms of it being supportive of your overall health function, your strength levels, and that kind of thing. But then also, it can become very addictive to want to chase these calories burned. And that can result in us being in extremely large deficits and really struggling with our relationship with food, getting into the realms of disordered eating and eating disorders. So we want to avoid that hyperfixation on this kind of data. And then on top of that, in the performance world, what I see is a lot of people will be so data focused, but they'll struggle to be smart with that data. So they'll really struggle to like leave their ego at the door, for example. They'll just want to hit a PB when they're running every single session, as opposed to being able to detach themselves from that and listen when they need to rest or when they need to work at a lower intensity. They completely kind of, I guess, ruin their ability to do that by becoming so fixated on the data. They completely lose the ability to be intuitive, which actually can have a negative impact on performance goals, as well as our relationship with food and body image. We want to keep that intuition intact. We want to be able to give ourselves permission to rest when we need it. We want to be able to give ourselves permission to reduce volume or intensity when our bodies genuinely need that, because that becomes the most productive thing for us to do, as opposed to blindly following numerical data that is incapable of taking that internal data into account. So that's another factor, especially if you're someone who is, chasing or supporting clients who are chasing performance goals, as well as, potentially body composition, health-based goals as well. It has its problem in that area of the fitness industry, as well as with those who might have struggled with their body image and relationship with food in the past. Another thing about rigid approaches that place a lot of emphasis on discipline, for example, they don't usually involve practicing much compassion at all. And compassion is something which is really necessary for positive long-term change, regardless of what your goal is. And a lot of people mistake compassion for being something that is just taking a soft approach towards yourself. That is absolutely not the case. There are times where you do need to cut yourself a little bit of slack, give yourself permission to rest, etc. But compassion also involves showing up sometimes when you don't want to for your own good. It's just an approach that really promotes positive long-term change from a place of self-respect. And that is absolutely necessary if you wish to see long-term success with your goals. So that's something that rigid approaches and these approaches kind of revolving around this grind harder mentality and enforcing discipline really miss out on. And another thing on the note of discipline as well is it's something that becomes very hard to enforce at certain times in our lives and easier to enforce others, which a lot of these like really rigid approaches fail to take into account. And so sometimes when you're trying to enforce this discipline on yourself and it feels really hard, you can feel like there's something wrong with you if you're just following this sort of like cookie cutter program, this grind harder program, or working with a coach that's just telling you to work harder. It can be like, why am I finding it so hard to actually do this work? Because you're not a robot. Like there's so much more to it than that. And you have to be able to recognize that in order to see this positive long-term change so that you don't end up falling into the trap of thinking that there's something wrong with you and then dropping off the program because you feel incapable of doing what that coach or that program is telling you to do. There are times in our lives where we're going to find it really hard to do those things. And that's okay. And that's what, taking a more flexible, compassionate, and holistic approach does take into account. That really enables you to make that long-term change that you're trying to make. Moving towards a more flexible approach to nutrition is also likely to improve your ability to listen to and honor your body's hunger cues. And in a very similar vein, taking a more flexible and intuitive and holistic approach to training will also, like I've just mentioned in that past point, allow you to hear your body when it's telling you it needs a break as well, which again will contribute to your long-term success. But going back to that point on nutrition and taking a more flexible, holistic approach, allowing you to listen to and honor your body's hunger cues, this will help prevent things like your relationship with food taking a hit. It will help prevent you from struggling with things like overeating, and it will overall be supportive of your health. There are so many different things which will influence our energy requirements and our hunger cues, and it's really important to recognize that. And sometimes, if we take a really rigid approach to things like nutrition and we're following really strict meal plans or rigid macro targets and calories, we completely switch off from our body's hunger cues in order just to hit these numbers. And that is actually something that's quite damaging, and it's really hard to then get back in tune with your hunger cues over the long term. And therefore, it can be really difficult to know when to sort of begin and end eating. And when, there might be certain days where your body doesn't need as much fuel as the numbers that you're trying to hit, or vice versa, where you need a little bit more energy coming in than the macros or the calories that are assigned to you. And if you can allow those fluctuations, it will result in a much more healthy relationship with food and your body. You're treating it with respect, you're treating yourself with respect. It will also result in better performance and overall health and well-being, because on the days where your body needs more energy, you're actually allowing it rather than resisting it. And it will result in a lower likelihood of things like overeating, because you are you're allowing those fluctuations, so you're less likely to feel deprived or restricted. And we know that enforcing restriction can increase our food focus and our drive to overeat. So it's really important to recognize all of those things as well. We often also find that when we do, like I've said about restriction, when we try and enforce this excessive restriction, whether that be in really limiting our energy intake or whether it be in trying to cut out foods or food groups, we find that we often see increased hunger levels in line with that. Or if you're trying to exclude certain foods in particular, you'll see with that restriction an increased drive to eat that food, which can increase our risk of overeating and therefore impair our ability to achieve our goals as well. We often see a higher rate of dropouts and relationship with food struggles with a rigid approach. So you're more likely to actually see long-term success with a more flexible approach, which I think people struggle to wrap their heads around sometimes. But we actually see a higher likelihood of weight regain with really rigid approaches. So a flexible approach is something that can be really supportive of our long-term success when it comes to achieving our goals, whether they be body composition related or whether they be with our performance and overall health. Rigid dieting often also increases feelings of stress and anxiety beyond a slightly more flexible approach, which can lead to an increased likelihood of overeating in itself, because we often turn to food and overeat when we are seeking comfort or when we're trying to numb out from certain feelings. So if we've got that increased stress and anxiety, we're going to be then more likely to turn to food for comfort, and at an increased risk of overeating as a result of that. We're also going to be at an increased risk of turning to food for numbing those feelings of stress and anxiety out that the rigid approach itself has caused. So it's really important to take that into account. An example of the kind of stress we can experience when we're trying to take a really rigid approach is that which might come with weekends away, holidays, social occasions, weddings, that kind of thing, because we worry, how am I going to stick to this rigid approach when I'm attending this wedding, or I'm going for this weekend away, or I'm going for this holiday, or I'm going out for this meal? We panic about, oh gosh, what am I going to order off the menu? What am I going to have to take with me? Has the place I'm going on holiday to got a kitchen? Has it got a gym so that I can get all my workouts in? We worry about so many more different components that if we were taking a more flexible approach to nutrition and to the process, and we were taking a more holistic approach, we wouldn't have those same worries because we would learn that we don't have to weigh everything out. We don't have to have control over every bit of food that's going into our mouths. We don't have to worry if we miss a session because we can just complete it on another day. So that's an example again of how taking that more flexible and holistic approach actually reduces our stress levels, reduces our feelings of anxiety, and therefore can positively contribute to our long-term success, help with keeping our health and quality of life intact, and reduce our drive to overeat or to seek comfort from food. So I really hope this podcast has helped give you a few points to consider that help you change your perspective on flexible dieting and taking, and when I say flexible dieting, I mean taking a flexible approach to nutrition as opposed to a rigid approach. I hope it helps you see the benefits of that. And I hope it helps you see the benefits of taking a more holistic and flexible approach to setting activity and training targets as well and to pursuing performance goals because it's honestly one of the best things you could ever do for yourself. And the misconception that we are going to completely lose control, gain a ton of body fat, not see any progress towards our goals when we take a more flexible approach is just completely not true. It's actually the opposite of true. So hopefully this podcast helped you wrap your heads around that. If you have any questions off the back of this, if you have any feedback, if you have any comments or requests for future episodes, I would absolutely love to hear from you. So please don't hesitate to drop me a message. My Instagram is Danny Bosworth. And if anyone is interested in coaching, I do have a handful of spaces available at the moment. So I will pop my inquiry form in the link below. Head over there, submit an inquiry, and I'll be in touch with all of the information you need. It would be a pleasure to hear from you and so lovely to help you achieve your goals for good this time. Have a great rest of your day, and I'll chat to you soon.